this is what economics is. This is it, you know?
It's all wrong. It's all completely wrong. Is this going to be okay for the level of the audience?
Yeah.
Okay. Have you heard of what are called the Cambridge controversies?
No.
My God, you guys got a lot of reading to do. He fundamentally based his work on Irving Fisher. You've heard of Irving Fisher?
The debt deflation theory.
Yes. Yeah.
I got one.
Okay. That's a short, it's only 13, I think it's 13 pages. This happened, I took a bunch of journalists to China back in 81, 82. Long bloody story there. I've got lots of stories. And you should read Marx, definitely.
Yeah.
Some of the most important developments in economics came out of Marx.
Also, how did you predict the financial crisis?
I made one big mistake at that time, and that's I took on a bet over house prices.
Wow. Oh, you fucking blow my mind. Honestly. What advice would you give to young economists?
Don't learn economics.
Oh, seriously?
You seriously learn system dynamics. Okay.
More people die from cold weather than, warm weather. And so they're painting this picture. What do you think about that?
They deserve to be tried in Nuremberg for ecocide. Wow. I met Minsky once.
Oh, you actually met them?
Met him, yeah. Wow. And I was so overawed. I really was. Like I was like you guys, okay? Overawed. And
No, you're right.
and I sort of freaked out, and I wrote something which I think he would have thought, what a wanker, and never got back in touch with me again. But anyway, met him once.
Today's episode is with Professor Steve Keen, world-renowned economist who predicted the 2008 financial crisis. He authored famous books such as Debunking Economics and his new book, The New Economics Manifesto. He, as I said, predicted the financial crisis. He's also been on Lex Friedman, has one of the top Lex Friedman pods, 2.8 million views.
Classic.
And what a pod it was. I think this Inspire Us pod was top. Let's not compare, but yeah, this was a crazy one. Yeah. What do we talk about, Dara?
We talked about an array of things, and I'll be honest, most of it went over my head, but it was great. We even got a physics lesson in there too, and I'm going to go over the conversation myself and take some notes, and I'm also going to get that reading list from Professor Keen.
Yeah, no, we have a lot of reading to do.
So much reading
and
to
studying after this pod, but yeah, like and subscribe, follow us, and we hope you enjoy.
The Inspire Us podcast.
Yeah. Well said. I was surprised when you said, this stuff should have been reviewed 100 years ago.
It's been the first genuine mathematical proof that the theory was wrong was done by mathematicians in the 1910s. A pair of mathematicians called Peron and Frobenius. And they didn't even know about economic theory. They just did they're doing the mathematics, what's called they're working out the dominant. This is going to sound weird if you haven't done mathematics, but they're trying to work out what the dominant eigenvalue was of a positive semi-definite matrix.
Oh wow!
Now what ridiculously that undermines Volra's theory of teutonement, okay? Because when you set up Volra's theory of trade, what Volra had was a big market where they're all consumers. There are no intermediate goods. Everybody turns up with either consumer goods to buy or sell. The auctioneer declares a set of prices, and that's a vector, obviously. The products that you're buying and selling, whether you buy or sell, is a matrix. When you convert that across to a production system, which is what you need to model capitalism, all the elements are non-negative. You either use 0 units or more than 0 units of each commodity, produce every other commodity. So that's what's called a positive semi-definite matrix. Now, what Volra assumed was that the process, you could start with a random set of prices, and then that random set of prices would cause all sorts of markets to be in and out of equilibrium. But the horizontal, or the diagonal of the matrix, was purchases of one commodity, exchange of the individual commodity, apples for apples, et cetera, and that's the directive. When you change the price, say the apples, you're affecting the market for apples. whereas you're also affecting the market for pears and bananas and, semiconductors and all that sort of jazz. So just the price changes on the diagonal necessarily move towards equilibrium. Okay? And then Volra said, well, all the diagonal dimensions, they move to and away. So maybe they cancel each other out. And so the process of a random set of prices adjusts so you get equilibrium on the diagonal for all commodities, and then feed the impacts through all the other markets, which will be pushed in and out of equilibrium. That process will gradually converge towards equilibrium. Now, for that to be true, this is again getting the mathematical bit, the dominant eigenvalue of a positive semi-definite matrix had to be less than 0. And what these two mathematicians proved, Bjorn and Frobenius, was it's greater than 0, which meant that process would never converge to equilibrium. Okay? Now, if economists had actually taken seriously what mathematicians do, that would have been, oh dear, that must mean prices exchange occurs out of equilibrium. We've got to abandon equilibrium. What did they do instead? They made equilibrium into a religion. And that's where it went wrong. So you literally can take it back over essentially and say we should have gotten rid of neoclassical theory 110 years ago.
That's the thing. The first thing they teach you when you start economics class, they teach you about the theory of the firm, all these things, and you get to uni, and then they start teaching you about the utility function and all these things. How do you feel about that? This is like the main. We don't even know that there are other ideas. This is what we're taught is these equations, like math. This is what economics is. This is it.
It's all wrong. It's all completely wrong, and every possible level. So, like when you have the idea of describing an individual's consumption using utility curve, indifference curves, that works on a sheet of paper when you have apples on the vertical axis and bananas on the horizontal, and you're supposed to work out what's the combination of apples and bananas that you're indifferent to, and that's not hard to do. It's even if you imagine like between 0 and 10 bananas and 0 and 10 apples, there's 121 combinations. It's pretty easy to work out which ones you prefer. The price is only one relative price. That's fine. When you try to say, let's add in like water, chocolate, watching videos, et cetera, each time you do that, you go for an extra dimension. So there's 100, if there's 0 to 9 choices for each on 2 dimensions, that's 100. Then at a third dimension, that's 1,000. At a fourth, that's 10,000, fifth, 100,000, blah, blah, blah. You get to the stage where you get a ridiculous array of potential combinations. Nobody's mind can keep track of it. So nobody shops that way. Okay? It's a false description of how people shop to begin with. Then when you try to aggregate it, if you heard what are called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem?
Never.
Okay.
Never.
You've done the whole indifference curve. Is this going to be okay for the level of the audience?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you're victims of an economics degree, and if you've done microeconomics, you've done deriving an individual demand curve at some point from indifference curves. You've done that bit yourselves?
Yeah, so painful, but yeah.
It's so painful, okay. So what you draw, on the vertical axis, you draw the commodities you're not changing the price of, and on the horizontal, you draw the commodities you are buying, changing the price of. And you have an intercept on the vertical axis, which is your total income divided by the price of the other commodity. So, and that you assume those prices don't change and your income doesn't change. So what you then do is you say, well, let's change the price for bananas, $1 per banana, 50 cents per banana, blah, blah, blah. And then you get the straight line connecting spending all your income on the other goods to spending all your income just on bananas. That gets flatter. And then that means you can move out to a higher set of indifference curves. Do they take you through what they call Hicksian compensation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Pain in the ass.
Pain in the ass. So because with that, downward sloping trick, if you do it with a commodity which is, like potatoes, the classic example they give, the cheaper the potatoes get, the less potatoes you buy. You buy more stuff because other food's more attractive. That's their explanation for the bloody Irish potato famine. So they then do the Hicksian compensation and then say, well, we readjust your income so that we compensate for the higher effective income you have because of the lower price. And therefore, what we do is we take points of tangency on each indifference curve. And that necessarily gets flatter as price gets higher. Therefore, law of demand, the price falls. Okay? Now, that's what you get taught in micro. try to find in any textbook where they say what happens when you aggregate. You will find it stated in one textbook, which is Nordhaus and Samuelson and Nordhaus's textbook. And fittingly, for what I think of Nordhaus, there's a lie. Outright fucking lie at that point. Because what I say is, does the law of downward sloping demand curve apply to the market? It certainly does. Bullshit. Because what the mathematical economists did, this is Sonnenschein, Mandel, and De Boer in the late 60s, early 70s, what they acknowledged was that when you're working for an individual, you can presume their income isn't changed and the price of other goods isn't changed by changing the price of bananas. You keep those constant. But if you want to have a market for bananas in the whole of the UK, you've got 60 million people. As soon as you go from individual demand curve to market demand curve, you go from one person to 60 million. Now, when you change the price of bananas, you are going to affect the income of various people. So you can no longer keep that income constant, okay? If you had across the whole 60 million people to get the market demand curve, some are going to get their income boosted by bananas getting more expensive, some are going to get them fall. So that point of pivot on the individual curve moves for everybody. Now then, the mathematical economist said, under what conditions can we be sure you're still going to get a downward sloping demand curve? And here's where the nonsense, the addiction they have to that way of thinking comes in. The condition they came up with was that you will get a downward sloping demand curve so long as everybody has the same relationship between price and income, and that doesn't change with income. So that's, you've heard what are called Ingalls curves?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar. But
the idea with an Ingalls curve is you have your, like when you're doing the price derivation, what you're doing is you're changing the slope of the budget line, but you're not changing the point of the max, you're not changing the income. With an Ingalls curve, you move the income out. You say what's going to happen to your consumption. And they'll go through this garbage in the textbooks as well. Or they'll say, well, there is luxuries where, or the necessities rather, where as your income rises, you spend proportionally less on that particular commodity. So toilet paper, okay? If your income raises by a factor of 1,000, you're not going to buy 1,000 times more toilet rolls. Okay? But if you take a look at, Louis Vuitton handbags, then yes, that's going to curve. So what you get is necessities will have a curve that gets flatter, and luxuries will have a curve that gets steeper. Now, they're the only way to guarantee the result that they wanted for a downward sloping market demand curve was the Ingalls curve as a straight line. And I'm better than that. It's the straight line for everybody. Now, they don't even realize this. That is proof by contradiction. Because they start from saying, imagine you've got two people with different tastes and two commodities with different characteristics. Under what conditions can you aggregate? When you have one person consuming one commodity. That's proof by contradiction. In other words, and this is what when you read the sensible people who did this, moderately sensible because they are neoclassical, Sonnenschein and Schaefer give the best interpretations of this result. And it's in the Handbook of Mathematical Economics, by the way. Okay? So, edited by Arrow and Trilligator. So it's one of these top neoclassical publications. They say strong restrictions are needed to ensure that the market demand curve has the properties of an individual demand curve. So this is the real punchline. The utility function tells us nothing about the market demand curve. Now, do they teach you that? Of course not. Okay. That was a point where they said we simply cannot derive a market demand curve which has the characteristics we draw in every bloody textbook. So it's intellectual dishonesty on a grand scale. And it happens because it's a bit like you've got a bunch of Catholics, who end up finding the body of Jesus Christ. What do? They pretend it's somebody else. They don't take it seriously. So this just reeks all the way through the system. And they continue with this theory, even though they've managed to mathematically undermine it. And that's you people get this simplified, trivialized version in the textbooks, where if you read the actual literature and read it with a critical eye rather than a sycophantic eye, none of this stuff, we should have thrown it out, as I said, 110 years ago with the Peron Frobenius conditions, 80 years ago or 70 years ago with the Sonnenschein-Mandel-Leboeuf theorem, because the first people to discover that were, what's his name? Gorman in 1953, the year I was born, 71 years ago, and Samuelson in 56. So that long ago, if they'd seriously assessed what they'd found, they would have said, we can't derive a market demand curve.
Yeah.
Well, what are we wasting our time with then? Okay. And the theory of supply, do you know the Housel's and the theory of supply?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, have you seen the research of like Fred Lee?
Never.
Okay. Fred Lee wrote a brilliant book called Post-Keynesian Pricing Theory. And what it really is a incredibly detailed history of economic thought of economists going out and surveying companies and finding out, do they have rising marginal cost? Now, every last survey, there's about 70 that have been done, every last survey has found the majority of firms report constant or falling marginal cost. Okay?
Yeah.
What do you get caught in the textbook?
The opposite.
Bullshit. Okay? and they simply refuse to look at it because it means, first of all, you don't have an upward sloping supply curve, so the whole marginal cost equals marginal revenue thing goes out the window. You can't derive a market demand curve that has the downward sloping carrot. The whole foundation is rotten, but they hang on to it because it's an incredibly seductive ideological vision of capitalism. And they're not even aware that they're ideological. They think they're mathematical.
Why do you think people have held on to these ideas for so long? And we spoke to Ha-Joon Chang.
Oh, yeah.
He was
I've never met him, you know.
Haven't you?
We should have got together ages ago, but circumstantial. I've never actually caught up with him.
But you guys are quite similar.
Oh yeah, very much so.
In your ideas about economics, and he was talking about his pushbacks in his career because of his ideas, and they like hound him out, completely berate him, calling this radical lefty. When if you actually looked at it or just analysed his ideas, they're not even that left leaning. They're quite moderate. He's very pragmatic, and I'm sure you've had a similar experience.
Exactly. I mean, it's, or you're simply saying, well, let's look at the empirical and logical foundations here. The empirical foundations contradict your theory, and logically, you've undermined your own damn theory. Why do you continue sticking with it? And I have a fair understanding of that. I don't know that Ha-Joon Chang was the same as me in this sense, but I swallowed this stuff at school. Like I did economics in year 11 and 12 at university at school in Australia, and we had a brilliant lecturer teacher in first year, and the year 11 not so good in year 12, but I really got sucked into the whole thing. And what it gives you is a vision of a perfect anarchist society. But what you've got is a system with no power, okay, the perfect competition and all this sort of jazz. There's no power. There's no exploitation. You get paid what you're worth. Okay? You receive your marginal product. And it's self-managing. You don't need a government. Now, in a crazy way, that is a vision of a perfect anarchist society. And that's what sucks people in.
But it's so wrong. I mean, that's what I'm so grateful for my heterodox background, because they teach you these things are just utter lies. And I love Mario Mazzucato's work.
Yeah.
She points out about how much the state is involved in the economy, and just the ideas about unfettered capitalism isn't even real. The state plays such a central role in, and yeah, it just makes me ever so grateful, because lots of people, they're advocates for little state intervention, just letting the market do its thing, and they also take on this idea that, oh yes, we need to watch out for the deficit as well. Like your average person would say, yeah, we need to really worry about the public deficit. And your idea about, or you highlighting in your book about how government spending is actually a prerequisite to taxation, how I think even it's sort of like it's public spending is the private sector's savings or money. And these are like, most people don't know this.
I know.
And it's quite alarming. And how would you change this? What do we need to change this?
It's impossible to convert anybody who's fallen down that rabbit hole. I've given up. I've got plenty of, I can actually say some of my best friends are neoclassical economists, okay? But there's just no way you can get through the overall vision, because it's a bit like trying to convince the Pope that Jesus Christ did not go to heaven, okay? Forget it, yeah? You can have the DNA. You can have the proof there. You can show that Mary wasn't a virgin. He's not going to listen to you.
But what are their rebuttals? What do they say back to you? Especially the stuff about money. Like, how can they argue against that?
They simply don't even look at it. I've only just got my head around this recently because I've had a few, again, with people that I quite like on the non-orthodox side. A guy called John Hearn, who's a local academic here. What's his name? George Selgin, who works for the Cato Institute, and was one other that I've had interactions on this topic with. And you show them the accounting, and they don't even look at it because all they want to see is supply and demand curves intersecting the loanable funds model and stuff like that. They simply don't take anything as an alternative seriously. And what you realize that they're doing is that they're not reading you to see what your arguments are and assess them and engage with you intellectually. They're reading to find something they don't like and they can get angry and stop thinking about you. So George Selgin was probably the best example of this. So George is an Austrian. He's sort of half Austrian, half neoclassical. Yeah. And unlike most neoclassicals, he's not particularly mathematical. So he wrote what he called was a definitive critique of the argument that banks create money, which he called it the frankly silly idea that banks don't have to borrow in order to lend. And what he did was he went through and it ruled out term deposits. Because if you put money in a term deposit, then you can't access it. And so the bank can and does lend that money out to somebody else. Yeah. But when you put money in a straight old standard bank account, it's demand deposit. If you put £1,000 in the bank account and then come up the next day and see you've only got 600 there, you're going to scream, I've been robbed. Okay, so the banks cannot lend that out. So he ruled out term deposits, which is sensible. He ruled out person-to-person lending. He ruled out cash. Okay? And I said, okay, this is very careful. What he's doing is eliminating extraneous issues that aren't relevant to the subject of do banks lend out deposits or not. And I wrote this list of assumptions he made, and I said, these are sensible assumptions. He got angry at one of the assumptions. He said, I didn't assume that. Keane thinks I didn't think that. Fuck you, George. I was agreeing with you. Yeah. So he saw the line where I said he assumes cash doesn't exist. He said, of course I know cash exists. Yeah. So he just looked for something to get angry at. And then he just rejected the remainder of my argument. And that's what happens. You cannot get them to engage with you. And this is not something which is simply exclusive to neoclassical economists. Have you read any of Thomas Kuhn?
I've never read any.
Really recommend you read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn.
The Structure of
Scientific Revolutions.
Okay.
There's a few other books in the same area, the history and philosophy of science area, but Kuhn was the one who established the idea of a paradigm. And in that book, he was trying to, he actually started out to do a PhD on the change from the Ptolemaic to the Copernican vision of the universe. And he was working from Popper's idea that scientists come up with bold conjectures and then try to refute their own conjectures. Popper's definition of a scientist was somebody who makes a bold conjecture and then tries to refute it. Okay, and that is actually the definition of a schizophrenic. Okay, so but that was accepted as how scientists actually behave. They make a proposition and then they try to destroy the proposition, and then what's left is a kernel of truth. And over time, the kernel grows, and you go from myth to science. So that was the orientation that Kuhn had when he started doing his PhD, looking at the Ptolemaic astronomers, and then saying, well, they were believed in a myth, and then along comes the scientific proposition. And according to Popper, first of all, the astronomers at the time of Copernicus, who were mainly Ptolemaic, they should have welcomed this because, hey, somebody's finally refuted our theory. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. Of course, they did anything but they attacked Copernicus and Tycho Brahe and so on. But he also, when he looked at what the Ptolemaic astronomers did, he said, this is science, because they had a theory that the Earth was the center of the universe and that the stars and the planets and the moon and sun orbit the Earth. Now, that works fine for the moon, works fine for the sun, works fine for the stars, but not for the planets. Yeah. Because the planets, sometimes, as we know now, sometimes the planets are on the same side of the sun as we are, so they go one direction in the sky, and other times they're on the other side of the sun and they go the opposite direction in the sky. And if you try to explain that with the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe and we have these perfect concentric spheres on which everything orbits around the Earth, you can't do it. You've got to add another circle on top of the spheres, and that's called an epicycle.
Yeah.
And there's other adjustments they did as well. So because the actual orbits of planets is elliptical rather than circular, they then made that the center of the universe wasn't quite the Earth, slightly off, and that was called I think that was called an equant. I've forgotten most of the terms, but all these little modifications they had to make to the underlying concept that the Earth is almost the center of the universe, and everything. Then there are spheres, and you've got to get the rotation speed of the spheres that Jupiter is on, and Saturn and Mars and so on. And that was incredibly complicated work. And Kuhn looked at it and said, I can't call this unscientific. Okay, so what are they doing? And he worked out the concept of a paradigm. He said a science will have some concept they're trying to explain, like, the stars and moon and everything else in the sky above us. What do you think they are? Because this is back in the days when you simply had visual observation. Telescopes didn't exist. And we could only see 4 planets. Right? I think it was you could see Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. You couldn't see Mercury.
Wow.
And you couldn't see Neptune. Okay.
Yeah.
So they only had those 4 planets plus the Earth they were trying to explain. And the anomaly, the original idea that the Earth was the center of the universe came from Aristotle. There were people at the same time who proposed the sun was the center, but that got lost. So 1,500, 2,000 years ago, that was the vision, this Earth-centric vision of the universe. And everything was on perfect concentric spheres. Now, the planets violated that. So Ptolemy came up with the idea that the planets were on circles that rotated on the spheres, and that explains them changing direction, because sometimes the circle, they're going that way in the sky, and other times going this way in the sky because they're on a circle. Okay, and that then made a huge challenge. How do you map this paradigm to what you actually observe in the sky? So people were taking detailed measurements of the angle and location of each of the planets and trying to map to all these different models. And everybody had their own little set of tables. It was incredibly complicated, really mathematically challenging, arithmetic mainly, but challenging mathematics. And so that was Kuhn's explanation. They come up with a paradigm. But once you've got a paradigm, everything you think about the universe is with that view in mind. But there are anomalies. Okay? The date of Easter kept on moving. They couldn't get the calendar right. Navigation became challenging with the charts they produced and so on. So, and the real anomaly was this elliptical orbit of the planets. That was very hard for them to get their heads around, because if you're trying to map elliptical motion with circles, you can do it, but it gets really, really difficult, and the anomalies build up over time. So Tycho Brahe did the most detailed observations ever of the location of the planets. Copernicus came along with the idea, not the first one by any means, but the one who made the most eloquent statement of it, that the sun was the center. Okay? And then Galileo comes along and invents the telescope. Now that's game over, okay? Because once you've got the telescope, and Galileo literally made the world's first telescope. People had made magnifying lenses and stuff before. He realized you could put them together and amplify by a factor of 15 or 30, and then you could actually look at the moon. And what did he see? Craters, which means the moon was not a perfect sphere. And the craters mean there'd been collisions. And then he saw moons around Jupiter. Now, how can everything orbit the Earth if there are moons orbiting Jupiter as well? Okay? He could not get the Ptolemaic astronomers to look down the telescope. There's a wonderful letter from him to Kepler. Originally, they were rivals. They finally became friends. But there's a letter where Galileo writes to Kepler saying, what are we to say, my dear Kepler, with these learned men of the local university who refused to look down the telescope?
Wow.
Okay. Now, that's the same thing we found all the way through history. And the big change was that when Galileo came along, we're finally trying to experimentally verify statements. We're no longer relying upon the great books. We're now trying to verify to some extent. But even with that world, when you got to Maxwell's theories of electromagnetism, the Maxwellian idea of energy, I know some of my physicist friends regard Maxwell as the greatest physicist of all time. Okay? He managed to combine electricity and magnetism, incredibly sophisticated mathematics. And that assumed, which makes sense, given the concepts at the time, that energy was smooth. There's no such thing as quanta. But that then confronted what's called the black body radiation problem. Have you heard of that?
Never.
Okay. That any object is radiating heat. Okay. You and I, we're all radiating heat at the moment. And the profile of the radiation looks like a pimple. Okay. Goes up and then comes down again. When you try to fit Maxwell's equations of that, you could fit one side of the pimple. But then as you got to shorter and shorter wavelengths, the prediction of the amount of energy went up to infinity. It was known as the ultraviolet catastrophe problem. So Max Planck tried to solve that just as a pure mathematician. And from memory, I did this myself decades ago when I did a full maths degree while I was doing my PhD in economics. And I did complex systems and analysis. And you also learn what's called, you guys have done integration.
Yeah.
Okay. This is integration in the complex plane. You done complex numbers?
No.
Okay. Square root of -1 turns up. So rather than integrating along a straight line, which is what you do with standard integration, you integrate in what's called the complex plane. And you integrate around what's called a pole, where things go to infinity, or plus or minus infinity. And when he did that integration, he could solve the black body radiation problem, but it required a constant to exist, Planck's constant. So energy came in quanta. Now, he then, with that solution, he could then fit the actual experimental curve perfectly. And he tried to persuade, and this we're talking late 19th, early 20th century, just before Einstein turns up. It's the real beginning of the truly modern period of physics. Max Planck said he could not persuade a single colleague to convert from the Maxwellian vision to what he produced. He wrote in his autobiography, which is also worth reading, this is one of the great disappointments of my life, that I have never been able to convince another colleague to change their mind with a purely mathematical proof. And so it's not just economists who resist changing a paradigm. Okay? It's just the nature of how humans behave. We develop a set of beliefs about how something functions. We try to prove those beliefs, but then because the beliefs aren't completely accurate, anomalies will build up. And then the anomalies become a challenge that people try to solve. And ultimately someone will solve it normally from outside the field. And then they can't convert their fellow academics to it. The resistance is still there. But young people like you turn up, okay, and this anomaly has been discovered. And somebody like Planck or like Einstein who's actually found a way around the anomaly, but it was a totally different paradigm. You sit through lectures by their professors trying to teach you the Maxwellian stuff, and you're simply biding your time until they're forced to retire or die. You get hired, and you say, right, now I'm going to take on Planck stuff, and you get generational change. That doesn't happen in economics because the seductive vision, the people who haven't learned what you guys have learned at SOAS, the seductive nature of that vision of capitalism as a perfect system, it is deep inside students' minds when they're first exposed to it. And secondly, the anomalies we get in economics are not permanent anomalies. So any student, sort of, in the end of the 19th century, could reproduce the black body radiation problem. Any student back then could redo the Michelson-Morley experiment. Have you heard of that one?
No.
Okay. To explain how light got from the sun to the earth, when you presume that light was simply a wave, which is the Maxwellian vision again, there had to be some substance through which the wave passed. You're only hearing me because of sound waves through the air here. So there had to be a substance like that for light, and they called that the ether. And then what that meant was, just as if I was talking to you and there was a wind blowing, the sound would be slowed down. It was coming from you to me and sped up vice versa. Michelson and Morley reasoned that, the ether, which this substance that was thought to fill the vacuum of space so that light waves could pass through it, when Earth was moving in one direction around the sun versus the other, the rate of the speed of light should change. Okay, because just like the speed of sound changes when the medium itself is moving, the speed of light should also change. They did very careful measurements and they found absolutely no difference in the speed of light. Okay? Now, that was the beginning of that, led to Einstein's theories, relativity. Okay? Now, any student could reproduce that problem. So if you had people trying to resist Einstein and say, don't believe this Einsteinian stuff, don't believe that life is a particle, yada, 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 they would be listened to by the students because you have no choice. But at some point you're going to get the job to replace them, and you can bring this new theory in. So that generational change occurs. But in economics, what did you think of the Great Depression? You weren't there, were you?
No.
Okay. What about the inflation of the 1970s?
Missed that one.
You weren't born. Okay.
Too.
So the anomalies in economics are historic. And if people like Minsky come along, and Minsky's family is influenced by the Great Depression, and he wants to explain the Great Depression as anomaly, so he branches off. But other people go through and learn from John Hicks and Lionel Robbins, and still have this vision of capitalism as a perfect system right in the middle of the Great Depression. And then they can find enough people who believe that shit amongst the student body. They don't hire the Minskys or the rebels. They hire the mainstream people again. So they continue reproducing themselves despite these anomalies.
But why don't we take to economists like Minsky? Because when I came across his works, it was in like the early 20th century, right? And
Minsky,
yeah, and he came up with his financial instability hypothesis.
1956.
1956.
Not quite the early 20s.
Oh, okay, all right. So right in the middle. Okay, I got it wrong. But some of his observations about capitalism, if you read that today, it's kind of like he was a fortune teller to me.
Yeah.
And so how does he not get more attention? Why don't economists look at economists like Minsky?
Because he's talking about disequilibrium. And they've turned equilibrium from a shorthand necessary technique in the 19th century, which if you read Volra, or particularly if you read Jevons and Marshall, they regarded equilibrium as a short-term solution before we developed dynamic methods. But it's become a religion in the hand of the modern bunch, and there's all sorts of reasons as to why. And Minsky comes along and says it's a disequilibrium. No, you're a bastard. Minsky, I mean, I'm not friends with Randy Ray by any means, but Ray has told me that when he was giving lectures by Minsky would shut the door and make sure that none of the other academic staff hear what he was saying inside his seminars, because he'd be attacked in terms of hiring and, being ravished in the coffee room and stuff like that. So you're ostracized. If you don't accept the majority opinion, you are ostracized and ridiculed. And I've been through that myself over the last 50 years.
Wow.
How so? What have you experienced?
Oh, well, I mean, I'll give you one of my favorite examples. I was reading Sraffa's Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities while invigilating an exam at the University of New South Wales in 1988, I think.
Yeah.
And there was a particular member of staff who was a real thug, a polite thug, but like he was the sort of person who was the enforcer, called Bob Conlon. His nickname was Bob Colon. And he saw me reading Sraffa while invigilating this exam and mumbled quite loudly as he walked away from me. Frankly, I don't know why people aren't satisfied with marginal cost equals marginal revenue. I made it one of my life's ambitions to prove why that was bullshit, which I've done. But what you're doing, you're outside the belief system. And so when you're outside the belief system, it's like being a Muslim in the Catholic Church.
Do you think
you're not welcome.
Do you think you've seen a change from the beginning of your career to the end?
It's got worse.
You think it's got worse?
It's got worse.
Wow.
Reason being that, like, if I go back and think of people like when I was at Sydney University, I led a student revolt there in 1973, and I fought very vigorously with the then professor, Warren Hogan.
What was the student revolt about?
Over the teaching of economics.
What did you actually do? Did you just get a bunch of students and said, "Hey, we're taking"?
Oh, that's a long story. You've asked for it, haven't you? Okay. This is we were talking before you started recording about the 70s, and you know the old joke that if you remember the 60s, you can't possibly have been there. Okay. Well, it was pretty much like that. I arrived in. I'm born 53, 17, and turned 17 in 1970, get to university, and I'm still 17 in 1971. And it's right in the middle of the Vietnam War. This is Australia. So you face conscription to fight in the Vietnam War.
Wow.
Okay. The way out was either, it was a ballot. So your name went into a ballot, and if you're 1 in 5, you get drawn and you have to go and fight in Vietnam. You could get out of it if you were doing a university degree. Okay. You said if you're doing a university degree, you could defer your conscription until after you're finished. Okay. But at the same time, university students were some of the major groups leading the campaign against the Vietnam War. And I turned up quite conservative when I got to university. I could understand in fighting for freedom, but why was I being conscripted to fight for freedom? Real pain. What's going on here? So I read heavily about the Vietnam War, and I finally realised that it was actually an anti-colonial war. We're on the wrong side. Okay? So that my whole politics shifted because of that, and there were huge demonstrations against the war. And at the same time, the unemployment rate in Australia, and it was lower than most of the rest of the world, but this was common across most of the planet in the Western nations. The unemployment rate in Australia when I began university was 1.5%.
Okay.
You guys used to 4, 5. So there's no fear that being a student rebel and being a radical would stop you getting a job. And university wasn't quite free. It became free in 1973, but you didn't have to pay huge fees. Okay, you didn't have to work to pay all the shit you people have got to put up with these days. Just wasn't there. So what it meant was you really got heavily, and you could, and I did, get heavily engaged in politics and social life at university. It was a fabulous time to be there. Anyway, in the middle of first year, I was a complete believer in the neoclassical vision at this stage. And then we had this brilliant lecturer called Frank Stilwell. Frank's still alive and kicking, and he's a great friend. He became professor of political economy at Sydney Uni. Anyway, he explained what's called the theory of the second best during a first-year lecture. Have you heard of that?
No.
Okay. I think it won a Nobel Prize for its developers, Kelvin Lancaster, and I've forgotten the other guy who developed it. And what it was the theory, it said, imagine you're 2 steps from the neoclassical definition of nirvana. So you like the usual story, they say monopoly is bad, and trade unions are bad. Yeah, okay. What if you got both? What if you have both employer associations, which mean employers behave collectively, and trade unions, which means workers behave collectively? Rather than getting an equilibrium where the supply and demand curve cuts for demand for labour and supply of labour, rather than the equilibrium being that intersection, you got a marginal revenue curve, but you also got what's called a marginal social product curve. Now that gives you 2 different potential points of intersection. Okay? So when you have trade unions, and this is 50 years ago, so I'm going to be a bit hazy on some of the details, but the basic point was if you have both trade unions and employer associations, then the wage will lie between where the workers are being exploited by the capitalists and the capitalists being exploited by the worker. It's a relative power thing that will determine where the wage occurs. Now, if you abolish one or the other, and let's just say for the heck of it you abolish the trade unions, what do you do? Does that make social welfare better or worse? It makes it provably worse according to neoclassical theory. So if you have both trade unions and employer associations, and you want to make social welfare better, you've got to abolish them both simultaneously. I remember just sitting through that lecture and going, what? Because I'd accepted the whole idea, competition is best, and we should abolish trade unions and abolish monopolies. So, but this is ridiculous. You can't do the both at the same time. And why was my textbook teaching me about this? So I grabbed the textbook. We were using both Samuelson and a book called Lancaster at the time. So I had both Samuelson and Lancaster. Flipped through them, no mention of this particular dilemma. So I went down to the library after that, and I thought, what's going on? Because, this is stuff which I've had the theory explained to me by Frank. So I got the paper by Lancaster and I read it. And then I thought, this is amazing. Why was I not taught this? And I then got the latest bound copy of the Economic Journal, which I thought was the book I should look at. 1965 or 66, and I had a paper by two Marxists, Adam Baduri, and I've forgotten the other one. I thought, what are Marxists doing in the Economic Journal? You know? And then I found a paper by Samuelson called A Summing Up. And I highly recommend reading that paper because have you heard of what are called the Cambridge controversies?
No.
My God, you guys got a lot of reading to do.
Well, we'll probably get a little reading list from you afterwards.
You get a huge reading
if we
list.
can.
The Cambridge controversies were a debate between Cambridge, UK, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, MIT, over the definition of capital. Started by Joan Robinson, but the absolute coup de grace came from Sraffa. And Samuelson got in on the neoclassical side, trying to defend the neoclassical against the criticisms from Cambridge, UK. And at one point, Samuelson made what he called he explained, you've done isoquants?
Yeah, briefly, not.
Okay. Well, this is all the crap of the theory.
Yeah.
But this side, just like we've got utility curves for individuals, isoquants are supposed to show combinations of capital and labour that lead to the same level of output. And so you can have lots of capital, very little labour, lots of labour, very little capital. They both produce the same amount of output. And Samuelson conceded that was what he called a parable. He said, it's not real. He said, what actually exists, there's a whole range of different technologies that combine capital and labour in specific ratios. But then what happens is as labour gets, capital gets cheaper, for example, then you'll switch from one technology to another. And as you switch, you get this envelope. You're drawing a whole set of lines of different slopes. And ultimately, you form an envelope which looks like an isoquant. So we just tell these students this parable. And he then rubbished Marx's theory using the transformation problem in the same paper. I think it's either Baduri or Garignani, who's Italian academics, who came back and said, well, let's look at the conditions in which you can aggregate the capital. And it showed that those straight lines weren't straight lines, they were curves. Now, that blew Samuelson out of the water. And he finally, in this paper called A Summing Up, he conceded defeat. And the final section of the paper says something like this: if all the above makes you nostalgic for the old-time parables of neoclassical theory, we must remind ourselves that scholars are not born to live an easy existence. We must respect and appraise the facts of life. And I read that and I thought, wow, he's conceded neoclassical theory is wrong. Now I know there's such a thing as neoclassical theory. Does he mention that it's in his textbook? The answer is no. Okay? So from that point on, I realized I was being lied to by the textbooks. And I ended up being a group of about 6 or 7 activist students at this stage, a guy called Greg Crow, who became a fairly serious researcher in transnational corporations, an anarchist, Richard Fields. And we used to meet with the staff, and the staff were pissed off by the progressive staff were pissed off by the conservative staff and so on. So we tried to run a conference on radical economics. That was useless. That got nobody turning up. And I was completely disillusioned by the whole thing. And then in 1972, there was an election of the Whitlam government in Australia, and that instantly ended conscription. Okay, so all the energy people were putting into the anti-war was suddenly liberated. You still had a total boom going on, so nobody was worried about whether they get a job or not. And rather than focusing on the Vietnam War and all this stuff, we turned our energies towards what we were being taught at university. And 2 academics, 2 young researchers in the philosophy department, Liz Jacker and Anne Curthoys, wanted to put on a course in the philosophy department called Philosophical Aspects of Feminist Thought. And the department was run democratically at the time. And the department voted in favour of the course, but the professor voted against it, a guy called Armstrong. He then went to the next level and got the course blocked. The staff went to the level above that and got the course approved. Then the vice-chancellor blocked the course. So the philosophy staff said, we're going on strike. And they then went around asking all the other departments to go on strike. Now, ultimately, 40% of the university was on strike.
Wow.
Okay, including economics.
For how long?
3 months.
Wow.
Mate, you guys, I had a ball. Okay.
70 seems so fun.
70 was a incredibly amazing experience. So this was the strike began in 73.
Yeah.
And like as soon as the staff pointed out that the philosophy students were on strike, what I thought was an apathetic bunch of economic students also voted to go on strike. And we finally had we had a meeting one day with about 400 students in it. Total population of the students was about 1,500 in the economics department, and they voted for a day of protest. We then ran this day of protest about what we're being taught in economics, anti-neoclassical, obviously, and that then led to the rest of the faculty was against the economists. Accountants couldn't stand the economists. The statisticians couldn't stand the economists. So we got all the backing from the other departments to investigate the economics department. And that we had a faculty meeting over it. I was on the arts faculty, so I was president of the Arts Society, but I got invited to come along and speak in the economics faculty when the vote was taken. It was a secret ballot, and the vote in favour of investigating the department was passed by 24 votes to 14. Wow. And that investigation then led to the formation of a Department of Political Economy.
Wow.
Yeah, you guys caused a real kerfuffle.
Yeah.
Sorry?
You caused a real kerfuffle.
Oh, shit, yeah. It was marvellous.
Wow, the 70s did seem fun. But, I really wanted to ask you about Marxism and just your journey with his works. And because today they call Kamala this crazy Marxist, and it seems just so...
Her dad was also a Marxist professor.
Yeah, I guess.
Apparently they're estranged from what I've been told. I don't know, but they're not close anyway.
Oh, okay. But just the whole idea of... Because in America, if you mention the word Marx, it's just associated with these just bad connotations. And do you think... I just wanted to ask you, what is Marxism? And B, why do you think that... do you think the criticism is completely unjust? Does Marx's work still have relevance today? And just more about Marxism, essentially.
Okay, have you read Marx at all yourself?
I mean, no.
That's you said politician. He said I mean rather than yes or no. Okay.
I mean, I've seen like little snippets of his works, but I haven't actually read Marx.
Okay. This is actually back to the 70s. I'm going to have a lot of fun talking this.
No, please do.
There's a lot of history here. After the strikes in 73, we're successful across all the departments. The philosophy department was split in two. The staff didn't want that to happen. The vice chancellor made the split, but there was a department of they called traditional and modern philosophy, and a department of general philosophy. So they were split. We got a vote in favour of splitting the economics department, and that was the progressive staff wanted that. So the Department of Political Economy was formed in 1975 after the strike in 73. Italian went on strike. I mean, architecture had changes about how architecture was taught. So it's an incredible period. And at the end of it, we're all a bunch of lefties. We decided we should read Marx. So we formed a Marxism reading group. And this is how ridiculous this is. This is Sydney in summer, okay? You should be spending your time on the beach, okay? And I did quite frequently. But this particular summer, we spent it in a room about twice the size of this room, in the main quadrangle at Sydney University, reading Marx's Capital Volume 1 chapter by chapter. And I remember, I was already a skeptic on neoclassical economics, of course. And all I knew of Marx at the time we started the reading group was this argument that labour is the only source of value. And I just, that raised my skeptical hackles. And I remember walking to go to the first reading group meeting with another mate of mine who was also doing an arts law degree. And Sydney University is sort of on a hill, and you can see most of the skyline of Sydney from Sydney University. And we're walking along, and this was 1970, end of 73. There was a huge building boom, mainly commercial building boom going on. And this is a global phenomenon. If you look back at 73, 74 was a huge turning point in the global economy. And it was because of a credit boom that busted the next year. So we're walking along and you can see all these cranes building all these high-rise, skyscrapers in Sydney. And I said, I want a very good explanation from Marx as to why those things aren't adding value. So we sat down and we read from chapter 1 to chapter 33, I think, of volume 1 of Capital. And what you'll find, and I highly recommend you do this, read Capital itself. And what I found that Marx was doing in the first 7 chapters is explaining an alternative theory of value to the neoclassical theory of value. So the neoclassical theory tells you you've got marginal cost and marginal utility, and you price goods exchanged until the ratio of marginal costs equals the ratio of marginal utilities, et cetera, et cetera. What Marx argued instead was that he talked about use value and exchange value. And he said that in a sophisticated capitalist economy, they're unrelated to each other. So his argument was, if you go back to a primitive, pre-industrial societies, and you imagine 2 tribes meeting up on a border, and one tribe can make one product, and the other tribe can make a different product, and neither of them know how the other makes those different products, then at that situation, when you want to, let's say one group, and I'll use examples from another book I'm going to recommend in a second. Right. One group can make pottery, and the other can make white leather, okay? And neither know how they do it. And then when the group's seeing the white leather, that looks gorgeous. How many pots do you want for that? And the white leather group says, well, those pots look pretty useful. How many? And they bargain, and you get a relative price coming out of it. So Marx said in that situation, the utility of the product will affect the price people are willing to pay. Because as time goes on and you continue making those exchanges, then you start to produce extra white leather to sell to the tribe, and they start producing extra pots to sell to you. I said, so at that point, a commodity occurs or is created when the use value of something becomes divorced from its exchange value. So rather than talking at use value and utility and cost being related by marginalism, he's saying there's an absolute divorce of utility from exchange value. So use value becomes distinguished from exchange value. Now he then applied that to labour. He said in a capitalist economy, what then happens? He said things begin to exchange at their everything starts to be exchanged at its exchange value, which is cost of production. Okay? So things are bought and sold at their cost of production. Okay? And you buy them because they have utility, and you gain utility when you buy something, sure. But he said the cost is divorced from use value. But then he applied that to labour and said, what he was trying to explain is, where does profit come from? Because if you say everything is bought and sold at its cost of production, you can't explain superficially, how do you make a profit? And if you read Ricardo and Smith, have you read them at all? Oh, I'm giving you guys a hard time here.
No.
Okay, you should read them too. Neither Ricardo nor Smith could explain where profit came from. And this is when Marx first read the classical economists. He was saying, how can they can't explain profit. Because if you read Smith talks about how things exchange based on the amount of labour that it takes to make them. So if it takes twice as much labour to kill a beaver as it does to kill a deer, a beaver will exchange for 2 deer. Then he says, in this early and rude state of society, before the accumulation of stock, that's the ratio. He said, once people have accumulated stock and they put industrious people to it, this is rough quotes from Smith, they put, once stock is accumulated in the hands of some people, and they use it to put industrious people, other known as workers, to work, something must be given for the profits. Something. No detail at all. Ricardo also giving the explanation. So Marx's first challenge was, how do I explain the fact that there's that profit occurs? Where does it come from? And his very first explanation was to talk about labour versus labour value. Okay? So and this is, you'll find, it starts in his writings in about the mid 1840s. That's when he started reading economics. So he said, there's when you buy any commodity like a bottle of water, you buy the water, you drink the water. There's no difference between water and water power. He says when you pay the cost of production. So with labour, when you hire a worker, you don't buy the worker. It's not slavery. You're not buying as a chattel. So there's a distinction between labour and labour power. So when you pay for a worker, you pay for you pay labour, you get labour power in return. And there's no other commodity with the difference between the two. So the price of labour is the cost of production of labour, and the cost of production is the means of subsistence. So you pay somebody the means of subsistence, and therefore they're required to work for you. But what you've got is labour power. It might take 6 hours to make the means of subsistence, but they work for you for 12. So that's where surplus value comes from. That was his explanation right up until 1857. You're getting an idea that I've done a fair bit of reading here.
Honestly, I didn't realise how little I knew about economics until this moment.
Well, so this is an explanation Marx first developed because his PhD was in philosophy. He didn't study economics until he moved to Paris, and that's when he started reading the Economists. And if you can see a huge change in him from his first exposure, which is covered in a little pamphlet called the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. And you can tell he hates the Economists at this stage. He's really quite rude about Ricardo and Smith and how they disparage humanity and so on. But after he worked this explanation for where profit came from, he was a devout Ricardian at this point. And then in 1857, at this stage he was living in England. A friend of his called, I think it was Otto Brer, just dropped in to visit him one day in Chelsea. We're talking, very nearby. And Otto Brer had somehow found Marx's own copy of Hegel's philosophy of right. And in 1857, Marx was sitting up at the museum up here. We're only talking about, a kilometre away?
Oh, wow.
Okay. Sitting up there reading all the classical economists again, because he thought the revolution was about to occur and he wanted to write the definitive book, which became Capital. So suddenly he's reading Ricardo, reading Smith, reading all the classical economists at this stage, and suddenly he's got Hegel. So he reads Hegel, and you can literally tell the notes he was writing of his reading was called the Grundrisse, and that's German for rough draft, and the rough draft of Capital. And he never intended for publication. He's, ugly, really, really bad handwriting of all these notes. And suddenly he's reading Hegel. And you can suddenly see that his language changes to being very Hegelian. And I'm going to throw another curly at you guys. Can you tell me what dialectics means?
Isn't it this? All right.
Come on, give it a try. Give it a try.
Okay. Isn't it this conflict of two things? I'm clutching at straws, Mr.
Okay,
Dean.
but you've heard of
me.
thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Have you heard that phrase? Okay, lucky you. Okay, that's what people think is Marx's dialectic. Okay, so there's a thesis, an antithesis, and there's synthesis. It's almost impossible to pronounce. And as it happens, that's what I was told was Marx's dialectic method. And I'm reading Capital, trying to find it, and there's absolutely no sign of it. Okay, it turns out that was not Hegel's method at all. It was a guy called Fichte instead, and Marx only used it once when he was rubbishing an anarchist called Proudhon. What I found in Marx instead, when he read Hegel again, the dialectic that Hegel had was to talk about foreground, background, and tension, and the idea being that any entity is embedded in a society. There's no such thing as Robinson Crusoe. Okay? So any entity you consider will be in a society, and that society will focus upon some aspect of that entity, and that becomes the foreground. But the entity itself can't exist without the other things which are being ignored by society, which are its background, and therefore there's a tension between the foreground and the background. Beautiful, dynamic philosophy to explain change. So if you think about my favorite example, and this happened, I took a bunch of journalists to China back in 81, 82. Long bloody story there. I've got lots of stories. And anyway, we were being shown through the, have you been to China?
No, I wish.
Never.
Visit.
How long were you in China for?
Only 6 weeks,
Okay.
but it was a very intense 6 weeks. But we went to the Forbidden Palace, which is the the main monument in Beijing, and all the if you go there now, it's just a huge museum. All the interesting stuff has been taken out and put into other storage. When we went through, all the art objects that the emperor used to have were still there. And we went past one thing at one stage, which was about the size of this microphone thing. It was like my hand, okay. And it was going from the length of from my elbow to my wrist and bent over like I'm showing here now.
Yeah.
And that's solid gold. And the side here had rubies, emeralds, diamonds like you've never seen before. I mean, I'm talking diamonds that big.
Wow.
And one of the journalists, we were looking at it together, and she said to me, "What do you think it is, Steve?" And I said, "Oh, it's obvious, Jane. It's a back scratcher." Ha, ha, ha. I walked off and she caught up with me later. She said, "I asked one of the guards, it is a back scratcher."
Oh, wow. A very elaborate.
This is a back scratcher made of solid gold with diamonds and rubies and emeralds. Now, if you want to go and buy a back scratcher today and you go to 7-Eleven or whatever else, it's going to be made of plastic. Okay? So when you look at the feudal society and you're looking at what was made for the emperor, the use value was what mattered. Who cares how much it made? The emperor has to have a gold back scratcher. So feudal society focuses upon the use value and puts the exchange value in the background. Marx said in capitalism, it's the other way around. Capitalism focuses upon the exchange value and puts the use value in the background. Okay?
Wow.
So now he then applied that to labor and said, what does the worker get paid? Get paid the exchange value. Why is he paid the exchange value? Because the capitalist wants to exploit the use value. What's the use value of a worker? It's the capacity to produce goods and services to be sold. If they're not related to each other, there'll be a difference. And the gap between the use value and the exchange value of the worker, that's where profit comes from. And I thought that's brilliant. Truly brilliant argument. But exactly the same thing applies to machinery. Because what do you pay for a machine? It's cost of production. Why are you buying it as a capitalist? Because it can produce goods for sale. Incommensurable, there's a gap between the two, there's a source of profit. Now, that became my master's thesis, which I've never actually published. I published 2 papers out of it, but I have never published the actual work itself. And what I found was, by reading Marx, I contradicted the labor theory of value. And that went down like a lead balloon with my fellow Marxists.
What were some of the replies to your work?
They laughed.
Laughed?
They laughed. When I first, I discovered this, like in reading the first, here I'm back in this Marxist reading group with about 20 or 30 people in it. And I get to the point I've just found this argument and look at it and think there's a logical reason why any input to production can produce a profit. It's not just labor.
Yeah.
And I raised it, and there was the rest of them laughed at me. We went out for drinks that night, and one of the guys who was one of my close friends at the time, and I made the same comment. So you were critically exposed, Keen. And I said, "Bullshit, Mike, you bastards just laughed. You didn't listen." So I made that my first, when I went back to the university, I went to see where did Marx first find these arguments. And I found it in the Grundrisse. So you should read Marx, definitely.
Yeah.
Some of the most important developments in economics came out of Marx. Things like input-output analysis was Marx. And the philosophy that he developed is incredibly rich, but it undermined the argument that there's going to be a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And that was the basis of Marx's own critique of capitalism, that there'd be a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And he himself couldn't cope with the fact that he'd disproven it. And so what I did in the master's thesis is I wanted to find exactly where this insight first occurred to Marx, and then how did he react. And if you want to go to your library, you'll find a copy of the Grundrisse somewhere in the library on page 267.
You know the page.
I know the nation. You will find it 1.5 page long footnote.
Wow.
Where he first discovers this. Now, when he wrote the Grundrisse, it wasn't written for publication. Engels and others later put it together. It was actually first published in English in 1967 by Progress Press. Those are by Penguin, pardon me. And what he would have done, it was all handwritten notes, and then he would have suddenly, oh my God, I can see how I can use Hegel's philosophy as part of my economics. So he would have been asterisk, asterisk, asterisk with this statement, and it's 1.5 pages long when it's printed in the book. And it starts off with saying, is not a commodity to be conceived as a unity of exchange value and use value? In and of itself, how does use value turn up? Okay? Does this have significance in economics? Question mark. Okay? He's writing these notes to himself.
Oh, so you're seeing the breakdown of his thoughts.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's a major point of his intellectual development. And it occurs while he's sitting in the library reading a copy of Hegel because Otto Brahe dropped it into him at this time, while he's also trying to understand economics. Revolutionary point in his life. Now then, he starts to play with it, and he actually derives the argument that a machine can produce more value. Okay, he said it also has to be contemplated, which was not done above, that the use value of the machine significantly greater than its exchange value. Okay, literally, he didn't put the word "is" there. He said use value of the machine significantly greater than its exchange value. Would have been written in German, but the translation left out the "is," and I presume he left out the "is" in German as well. So at that point, he's realizing, and you can just sort of see him. Oh shit! What's happened to the labour theory of value? What's happened for the tendency for the rate of profit to fall? So he spends the next 50 or 60 pages trying to convince himself that he can make the two consistent. And he finally then says, the only unity, he says at one point, it was part of the dialectical method is to talk about what can oppose something else. And he says, the only unity that can oppose capital is all other commodities. It cannot be this commodity or that commodity, but all commodities. And then he says, oh, but the essence of all commodities is labour. And that's how he managed to pull himself out of the abyss. Okay? But it was a mistake. He was right initially to say it cannot be this or that commodity. It must be all commodities. Therefore, all commodities can be sources of surplus value.
How do you think now machine learning and AI is becoming more and more used in production and manufacturing? People are worried that it's going to replace labor. How do you think AI fits in all this?
I'm actually more interested in robots on that front.
Yeah, because now even with Elon Musk, and I mean probably a bunch of other companies are doing it. Humanoid robots.
Yep.
That, and they're obviously gonna have brains of AI that are gonna be able to replace human bodies.
Yeah, and this if we're not going to collapse into a climate catastrophe, that'd be the next dilemma for capitalism without a doubt. Because once you've developed robots like Musk is working on, a couple of other firms are doing as well, the main thing they're focusing upon is degrees of freedom for the hand. Okay, and if you have the only reason that a lot of manual labor exists because it was too difficult to automate. You guys worked in factories at all?
Not one day in my life, no.
Oh, you've missed out.
Yeah.
Okay. I've worked in a couple of factories. Like this is back when I was a young man, which is 50 bloody years ago. Manufacturing is much more important, even in Australia. And you could get a job in a factory doing various manual jobs. And like I've made filing cabinets for a job using spot welding machines. I've made air vents, and I was involved in a wine factory making wine as well. And so you realize that a huge part of the work that people do is automated and simplistic. Okay? It's the stuff which you can automate, if only it's worth your while to make a machine to replace the human. And that then comes down to the flexibility of a machine. And most machines, pre-robots, they simply had to go from one point to another point. So unless you could make the process something which had an absolute precision to it, you couldn't use machinery for it. And one of my favorite examples of this actually was back during the financial crisis. New York Times did a piece on a factory, and there's a woman whose job was in this factory making air conditioning units, was to insert I think it's called a thyristor. No, it's not a thyristor. A coupling device. I've forgotten the actual name of it, but it's a device which just a thermocouple, It's used to work out the actual temperature. And her job is just to insert this thing at about 1,000 or 2,000 bloody air conditioning units every day. That's all she's doing. And she basically said, you don't have to like your job as long as it pays you enough to stay alive. That's exactly the sort of thing you can automate with a robot. Okay? The work I did on the wine factory, picking up bottles of wine and moving it with a robot. Spot welding, robot. So long as you don't have to have imagination in what you're doing, this can be made robotic. So all the unskilled labour that is an essential part of why workers get a job, robots could eliminate that. And then that's a huge class conflict issue, because suddenly the only reason that capitalists pay workers' wages in jobs like that is otherwise they can't make a profit themselves. If they could produce the stuff without labour, or more cheaply with machines than with labour, then all that unskilled labour would disappear. And like 50 years ago, that would have been in Western countries. Now it's going to be in places like China. So you no longer have a capacity for the vast majority of the population to get an income from labour. And therefore, the only way you can guarantee an income is if you have a society which enforces the idea of a universal basic income. So like I know a lot of MMT types are anti-UBI, and I'm not, because if it weren't for climate change, I can see the day coming when there would be no role for unskilled labour at all, and therefore the only way you could get people a job was either to make work and like a job guarantee type thing, or to at least guarantee people enough to stay alive, because what we're actually, what keeps us alive is not so much our labour, it's the energy we're exploiting. Okay, and what we're really battling over is the division of the spoils of exploiting energy on the planet. And that's for that reason I'm in favour. Labour is necessary now to stay alive. Labour is necessary to produce output. But where we're going with robotics and AI and so on, virtually all of that can be done in an automated sense. And there would be no ultimate need for people to work to produce output.
Wow.
How do you think Marx's theory works into that? Do you think he saw this coming? And because it's about labor, and now we're talking about labor being completely replaced.
Yeah.
How does that?
Like Marx's work with the philosophical stuff that I discovered when I first read it. I'm not the only one. I'm the one who's probably most understood it. But another people who saw it was Rostolsky. Like, there's a book called The Making of Marx's Capital, an Australian guy called Alan Oakley, who also went through a similar titled book. And Sperling, I think his name is, who's a biographer of Marx. There's only about 4 or 5 of us who really understood this issue. And a guy called Wilde, a wonderful book called Marx and Contradiction. The rest of them, and I'm going to be disparaging here, have stuck with the labour theory of value. And to hang on to the labour theory of value, they've completely ignored this philosophical foundation. That's why I think what they've done is they've thrown out the baby and kept the bathwater of Marx. So I think there's an enormous richness in Marx, which is the proper philosophical foundation for a non-orthodox economics. But to do it, you've got to throw away the labour theory of value. And therefore, I have no time for most conventional Marxists because they've preserved Marx's initial ideas, but not the giant leap he made in 1857. But with that giant leap, you get a philosophical foundation for non-orthodox post-Keynesian monetary economics. And that's what I'm trying. Well, it's one of the things I haven't worked on it much for the last 30 years because I got caught up in everything else I've done in economics. But that to me should be the foundation, the philosophical foundation of economics should be Marx's philosophy.
And one of the things that you've done and that you've known for is that you predicted the global financial crisis. And I mean, in the world of economics, we know this, but I think the general public doesn't really know. I mean, there's that movie, The Big Short. We know those 4 guys.
Yeah.
So
all of whom I've met, by the way.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Why do you think you weren't really as recognized with all that? And also, how did you predict the financial crisis?
I made one big mistake at that time, and that's I took on a bet over house prices in Australia. And I've realised ever since, never take a bet, because journalists will only be interested in who's winning the bet. They won't want to know what the argument is behind it. That's partly what shot me in the foot in Australia. But I was well known in Australia for warning the crisis before it happened. And I got interviewed on the leading current affairs program in the country, which was called the 7:30 Report. And I got interviewed on that for half the program. And normally it had 5-minute segments, and I got 15 minutes. So I got quite a bit of exposure there. And in the non-orthodox economic circles, you'd know the Real World Economics Review.
No,
Seen it?
No.
Okay. There's a publication put out by a guy called Edward Fulbrook, which is originally called PACON, Protest Against Autistic Economics. Okay. That was formed back in the early 2000s by French students who began what they call the protest against autistic economics. And then Edward carried on for that and formed the Real World Economics Review, still being published today. And there was a vote taken in 2010, I think, as saying who most cogently warned of the crisis and whose work could do the most to prevent another. And I won that award. They had myself, then Nuri Rubini, and what's his name, Baker, can't think of his first name. The three of us got recognised in those circles. But we can't get past the bloody mainstream media. So I got a bit of exposure in the Sydney Morning Herald and Australian papers like that, but none in the conventional media. And the conventional media still they're still neoclassical. They don't even know they're neoclassical. That's half the hassle. So it's amazing how much we fall back on conventional wisdom. And that's what got in the way of me getting recognition in the public. I've got some, but nothing like. And the reason I saw it coming, I studied Minsky. So I first read Minsky in 1987, which is really appropriate because that was the year of the stock market crash. You aware of the crash in 87?
We were.
Didn't think so? Okay. The market fell 25% in one day.
Wow.
Okay. The biggest crash, 20% I think it was. The Australian market fell 25%, but the New York Stock Exchange fell 20% in one day. That's twice the size of the crash in the Great Depression. Okay? So it just happened that I was doing a master's at New South Wales University at the time. We had a great, really lovely non-orthodox economist called Bill Junor, and Bill set an essay for the macro course as a book review. And there's about a dozen books you can choose from. And I don't know how it was that I'd heard of Minsky beforehand, but I had. So there's a book called John Maynard Keynes by Minsky. I said, I'll choose that for my review. And it sounds like a biography, but it's not. He called it John Maynard Keynes as a tribute to Keynes because Minsky, his parents were Mensheviks, not Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, which is why they were in America, because they were driven out of Russia. And back to the question of Marx again, you won't find a single reference to Marx in any of Minsky's papers, not one. You know why?
Why?
Because if he'd mentioned Marx, he would have lost his job at a university in America. The whole, McCarthyist. He wrote during the McCarthyist days. And there's one little anecdote about Minsky. I met Minsky once.
Oh, you actually met them?
Met him, yeah.
Wow.
I was doing my master's at the time, and he was a pretty bad presenter, but I enjoyed his presentation. And he wrote to me after my paper modelling his thesis came out, and I was so overawed. I really was. I was like you guys, okay? Overawed. And
No, you're right.
and I sort of freaked out, and I wrote something which I think he would have thought, what a wanker, and never got back in touch with me again. But anyway, met him once. So the reason where he came from, his parents were lefties, Mensheviks, more radical than the Bolsheviks in that sense, in America. I think it was
sorry, the Mensheviks were more radical than the Bolsheviks.
Yeah. The Bolsheviks believed that they could bring about capitalism. The Bolsheviks believed they could bring about socialism without going through capitalism. Okay. So Lenin's idea was that you could overthrow Russia and then have go from feudalism, because Russia was very much a feudal society, to socialism, bypassing capitalism. Okay? The Mensheviks believed you had to go through the capitalist period. They didn't believe you could bring about the transformation of industry without a capitalist period. And you'll find that in Marx as well. I really highly recommend, just like if you want to have a short, interesting read of Marx, read the Communist Manifesto. Okay? Because in that, as well as being a critique of capitalism, it's also a paean to capitalism, because it says the capitalists developed the means of production. So the Mensheviks stuck with the belief you had to go through a capitalist period. You couldn't go from feudalism to socialism. That's one reason they were driven out of Russia. Anyway, so that was the intellectual milieu that Minsky grew up in. And I've forgotten how old he was. He's about 20 or 30 years older than me, I think. So he was a child of the Depression. And the question he set for himself is, can a Great Depression, happen again? And if it can't happen, when he was writing, it hasn't happened in 1982, which is when he wrote I think his most important books. He said, why hasn't it happened? So he asked the question, can we experience a Great Depression? What causes a Great Depression? Anyway, having met Minsky once in sort of 87 when I was still a junior academic and, reading all this jazz. I then went to the Levy Institute for a sabbatical in 2000 when I wrote Debunking Economics. And I met Hyman's son there, Alan Minsky. And Alan had a falling out with his father in his 20s. And he went across into what was called indie media at the time. So, social media, we might call it these days. That's what he was into. But then he had a sort of reconciliation when he approached his 30s. And he said, I went to ask Dad, what book should I read if I wanted to start understanding economics? And he said, just telling me the story, Dad went into the study and came out, and he's a book listener, and he bowed forward and gave me the book. And the book was Marx's Capital, Volume 1.
Oh,
wow.
Okay. So in that sense, Marx was definitely Minsky's foundation. And like me, he had a monetary interpretation of Marx. There's people, when they read Marx and they call themselves Marxists, most of them want to read Volume 1 of Capital. You read Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, and the 3 volumes of the Theory of Surplus Value, which I've done, then you find an incredibly rich monetary theory in Marx as well. So Minsky read all that, and he had a monetary theory of capitalism. And so his argument was, what causes a Great Depression? He fundamentally based his work on Irving Fisher. You've heard of Irving Fisher?
The debt deflation theory.
Yes, yeah.
I got one.
Okay, that's a short. It's only 13. I think it's 13 pages. Have a read of that. It's a great little book. So what Minsky wanted to do was explain how you got into the situation that Fisher described, where you had too much debt and falling prices of debt deflation. So Fisher simply assumed you started from a point of disequilibrium. You had too much debt and too low inflation, and then he explained the sequence of events that occurred after that. What Minsky tried to do was explain how can you get in that situation in the first place. And I found absolutely beautiful argument. So what he began was by saying he took an economy not in equilibrium, fuck that, okay? Not even in logical time. He said an economy in historical time. Now in historical time, there's been a crisis in the past. So his starting point was a period after a previous crisis when the economy stabilized enough to be what he called tranquil, the tranquil state. And he said in that state of tranquility, people, because of the previous crisis, investors and bankers will be conservative about the amount of leverage they're willing to take on because of the past crisis. But because the economy is now in a tranquil phase, backtrack, because there's been this conservatism, only conservatively estimated projects are put forward for funding. Okay? But because of this tranquil period, most of those projects will succeed. So people will reflect on what happened and think, oh, we should have borrowed more money. because if we borrowed more money, we'd have more leverage and make a higher gain. So he said, what happens a period of tranquil growth in a capitalist economy leads to rising expectations. And rather than this bullshit about rational expectations, he talked about a transition from pessimistic to what he called euphoric expectations. And then in the euphoric expectations, everybody expects there's going to be a boom going on forever. They borrow money, there's lots of leverage. The borrowing of money causes an increase in economic activity. The increasing economic activity enables workers to demand wage rises. It enables raw material producers to demand more for oil and raw materials. That increase in income going to workers and raw material producers cuts into profit. Profit isn't as high as people thought they would be. Investment slows down, you go for a crash again. So he gave a perfect explanation of going from a crisis to a tranquil period to a boom and then another crash. And I thought it was superb. But he didn't have he produced a bad mathematical model. And this again comes back. One of the great advantages of my career is I learned mathematics from mathematicians. I didn't learn the shit that economists teach. Okay? I did, but I knew it was shit. So I did like a full honors degree in mathematics while I was doing my PhD.
No, just the computer. I'm just going to get the thing to plug it in. I think we have a wire in the...
Oh, what's up? You're not...
No. Yeah. It's just we're going to plug in the computer.
Okay.
Oh, you have a...
What do you got there?
Wow. Oh, you fucking blow my mind. honestly. Because, see, I used to watch all of your videos.
Oh, yeah.
But, man, you went to town today. I've just completely
You just got me in a bad day.
Good day. But what advice would you give to young economists?
Don't learn economics.
Oh, seriously?
You seriously learn system dynamics. Okay.
Because you mentioned that in your book, didn't you?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I've realised over time. I first read System Dynamics with the Limits to Growth in 1972, and I thought it was a brilliant technology, and it's using fundamentally what you're building is systems of differential equations. You're in non-equilibrium, okay? And you're interacting systems, which is what the real world is. So that's the sort of technology we should be using. And learn the history of economic thought. The best book, I'll give you a book to read. Okay. Apart from Debunking Economics, okay, it's worth reading. But if you want to read a positive alternative explanation what economics should be, there's a book by a guy called John Blatt. It's called Dynamic Economic Systems, a post-Keynesian approach. And Blatt was a pure mathematician who was twice nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physics. He wrote the definitive text on quantum mechanics in the 1950s. So a hell of a good mathematician. And by accident, he got exposed to economic theory and realized it was a load of bullshit and then decided to go and to investigate why. And what he did was a meticulous historical reading of economic literature going right back to the physiocrats and then going all the way forward. And it's beautifully written, very, very deep philosophically and also very deep mathematically. But he knows he's talking to people who, from his point of view, are dumbos in mathematics. So he separates the mathematics from the textual explanation. It's superb. So that would give you, a fair bit of what I have learned you can find in that book.
We don't have the charger.
Oh, okay.
So I think maybe it's on 10%. Maybe we can cover one last thing and then just save it, and then maybe because there's a lot of stuff we wanted to.
It's so much.
There's so much stuff we wanted to talk about.
What do we?
I think we might have to cut it short, and then just to make sure we save it and it doesn't get lost.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
And then maybe we can run it again. I mean, we wanted to talk about climate change and energy. We wanted to talk about
because on Twitter you said, I think was it John Lomberg on the Bill Maher show.
That fuckwit.
Yeah, and he was saying, what was it? It was essentially that because by 2080 we'll have 450% increase in GDP and
2100,
some nonsense like that. And you said that you'll be able to draw a line in that drivel.
I could please, Mr. Key, through the back.
And because there's not only him, also Jordan Peterson, and you have people Vivek Ramaswamy. They talk about this thing, that they say, climate change isn't this catastrophe that we're being told, and that we actually prosper under fossil fuels, and that you have to look at these positive things. Things are better now than they were before. They say things like CO2 is actually good. The earth is more green. And then they say, more people die from cold weather than, warm weather. And so they're painting this picture. What do you think about that?
They deserve to be tried in Nuremberg for ecocide.
Wow.
They will lead to the destruction of human civilization, and quite possibly they will be responsible for blindsiding us to the greatest extinction possibly in the history of the planet.